Shana Tova. I wanted to take some time this evening and speak a little bit about Israel. You know, 75 years. 75 years. It's a number that we say very, very easily, but honestly, when it comes to the Jewish people, it is like cat years or dog years. Every year is like 20 years. Everything that happens in Israel, we feel it like twice as much. When you've been there, like Larry was for the summer, and we happened to have lunch together at a very good place, Azura, in Machane Yehuda, when you've been there, every day is like a month. You go to sleep and you wake up and you can't believe you've been there only for 7 days, right? You feel it's a month already. There's something about the land of Israel that makes us understand the world completely different. And because of what's been happening in Israel, with the turmoil of the political system, I think that we've been concentrating too much on the politics and understanding very little of the miracle of these 75 years and what they mean. And by the way, it's also 50 years exactly since the Yom Kippur War. I was very young. I don't remember what happened exactly on that Yom Kippur. But from the account of my parents, I know that being in the synagogue that night, that day, was something, if you were Jewish in 73, you will never forget. Because we actually saw face to face the possibility of losing the state of Israel. We never came so close as we did 50 years ago. Let me share with you an experience that I had this summer. I had the opportunity of being one of 14 rabbis that AIPAC took on an incredible journey through Israel to try to understand what was happening, but also to see things that are new that many of us had never seen before, and also to understand the way in which AIPAC works now, which I think is very important. We ended up in the city of Ramleh, not Ramallah, that's on the Palestinian side, Ramleh, close to Tel Aviv, in the heart of the industrial business park. We were taken to a facility that says Magen David Adom. That's the Israeli red Magen David, right? The emergency organization that rescues people from disasters and has the ambulances on the streets. And it looked like any other building from the outside. You know, and I've been to Magen David Adom facilities before, but there was something completely different about this one. The real building was 4 stories underground. And what they built, and they just opened it, by the way, we were there before it officially opened, is a blood bank and a breast milk bank that can withstand any possible attack from our enemies. And the reason why they had to do that is because beyond the rockets from Gaza and the rockets that will come from Lebanon, there's over 100,000 rockets pointed at the state of Israel. The Iranians have developed drones capable of pinpointing a target and destroying it in the heart of Israel. Yes, we will bring some of them down, but some will get through. And that's why we need to keep our blood, our reserve of blood and breast milk, underground. And this facility is unlike anything I've ever seen in my entire life. And when I walked out of there, I really understood what it means to belong to a people that loves life, that treasures life. That's what it means. To make sure that if there's a tragedy, God forbid, the resources to save our lives are kept safe and secure. So look, no matter what happens internally in Israel, no matter how loud we shout at one another, no matter how much we disagree, Israel's a miracle. And I want to share with you a story this evening. That is a story from my own family, well, from Lisa's family. You know, my family came all to Mexico from Ukraine, and everybody was lucky enough to be in Mexico by the end of the 1930s. But Lisa's family was really spread all over the world. Many of them went to Switzerland. Many of them went to Israel at the very beginning of the whole catastrophe. And so, going to Israel, visiting Lisa's family, is always incredible to me. And there was one uncle that Liz had that we lost this year, David Harman, who was one of the most humble, nicest, soft-spoken people I ever met in my life. I first met him at my wedding in Mexico City. He was younger than me when he came to my wedding. I keep saying the same thing over and over again. And David was very unusual. Let me just tell you who his parents were. His father, Avram Harman, was the third ambassador of the State of Israel to the United States. He was ambassador from 1959 to 1968, and then from 1968 to 1983, he was the president of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He decided he didn't want anything more to do with politics, and because Israeli politics are not for the faint of heart, and he went into education. And so David, Lisa's uncle, also went into education. And that's what he did his entire life. I admired him tremendously. The thing that I remember the most about him is that no matter who the prime minister was or the party in power was, he was one of the greatest Zionists I ever met. Yes, he criticized them, like we all do, which is okay. But his love for the state of Israel was not diminished because of the person who was sitting in the residence on number 3 Balfour Street. That's the address for the Prime Minister's office. And I want to share with you a story from David's life, which is one of the most incredible stories that I ever heard. I actually heard that once from him and once from his son Mishi. Now Mishi was about 10 years younger than Liz. Mishi has a podcast called Israel Story. And it's a famous podcast. You can find, they have over 100 episodes now, and he really has hit it off with the millennials. He's doing a tremendous job. The story is as follows. The summer before David actually was enlisted in the army, in the Israeli army, his father was ambassador in the United States. So they had to go back to Jerusalem to find David a place to stay while he was going to be in the army. Now, in those days, the army was 2 years. So they had to find for him an apartment. He was going to be a lone soldier. He was born in Jerusalem, by the way, in 1944. So he was actually born in Israel before the declaration of the state. But because his parents were diplomats in the United States, he had to find an apartment and live by himself. And by the way, David's mother, Zina, who Liz and I knew as Safta Zina because we went to many Shabbat dinners at her house, was not only a member of the Knesset during her youth, but she was Henrietta Zoll's personal assistant. So you have to understand, if there was ever a family with Zionist blue blood, this is it. Okay, so David and his father Abram are walking down the street in Jerusalem, and they're walking down Balfour Street. And suddenly, this very fancy car pulls over, and what David describes as an elderly lady puts her head out from the car, she lowers the window, and she goes, Avram, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in the United States. That was Golda, who was Avram's boss. She was the foreign minister. And he says, Golda, I'm trying to find David an apartment. He's going to start the army soon, and we have no place for him to live. So Golda, by the way, who in those days lived in Balfour number 3, which was the residence of the foreign minister, says, I have a lot of empty rooms. David can stay with me for 2 years, no problem. And I'm by myself. So David says, really? And Abram says, of course you're going to stay with her. And Golda says, and I won't charge you. He can stay with me. It's okay. So David Lisa's uncle was Golda's housemate for 2 years. And the way he used to describe it, and by the way, you can listen to the podcast because he will describe it with his own voice on the podcast, is amazing. He will come home from the army, and he worked in the intelligence unit. So Golda would say, so David, what are you doing in the army? And he would say, Golda, I can't tell you. And she would say, you can tell me. I'm the foreign minister of the state of Israel. And he would say, no, I cannot tell you. They'll court-martial me. And he describes evenings of drinking tea at her kitchen. He also tells the story of once he had a terrible toothache, and Golda fixed for him this incredible concoction, which was made with clove and ginger and vodka, and she put it on his cheek. Didn't do anything. But she thought it was great. Now, I tell you this story because Golda is now one of the most controversial prime ministers that Israel ever had. Because the Yom Kippur War could have been done entirely different. We could have attacked the Arabs first. We knew they were going to attack us. But Moshe Dayan and company advised her that the United States did not want us to attack first. So Israel withheld the attack, and the rest is history. I have to tell you, I just watched the movie Golda. And this is what sparked this entire story. If you have not watched the movie Golda with Helen Mirren, you have to watch it. And if they don't give Helen Mirren the Oscar, they're a bunch of anti-Semites. Seriously. By the way, if you ever watch Ray Donovan on Showtime, Liv Schreiber is Henry Kissinger, which makes it even more worth it to watch it. Ray Donovan is Henry Kissinger. I mean, that only happens in the United States. Anyway, this movie is incredible because it reminds me of David Harmon's stories. It reminded me of the table in her kitchen and Golda serving tea. And there is one scene when Henry Kissinger shows up in Jerusalem in the midst of the war. And he just came from Russia. And Golda offers him borscht. And he says, Golda, I just came from Russia. They fed me every day like crazy. I can't eat anymore. So Golda makes him sit down. She gives him borscht. And he goes, oh, this is delicious. And after saying that, and this line, by the way, is a story that actually happened. It's not a poetic license. Henry Kissinger says, Golda, I want you to know I am first an American, then I'm the Secretary of State, and then I'm a Jew. So Golda responds, Henry, it's okay. In Israel, we read from right to left. This is, by the way, this is the very point of our relationship with the state of Israel. No matter how you would put who you are in the order which you put it, you can always read it from right to left. And the state of Israel and us as Jews in the diaspora have a very unique relationship. And that's why when we see what's happening now, it tears us up inside. Look, when I came back this summer, and if you were here that Shabbat, I could barely speak. It was devastating to me. I happened to be at the airport, one of those nights when there was a protest at the airport. And I saw the police with their horses. And I saw the protesters. And I found myself in the middle of a scene that I would never thought could exist in Israel. However, a story that is little known from that night, a man by the name of Moshe Eliyahu was hurt in the protest by one of the policemen on one of his horses. The policeman who hurt him went to the hospital that same night. and spend the night by him, making sure he was going to be okay. Show me another country in the world where we can be at each other's throats, where we can protest the prime minister when he comes to the United States. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. My opinion right now doesn't matter. But show me another country where millions of people literally have protested and no one has died. Look at France. They had their protests. It was chaotic. Look at what happens in Iran when people protest. Look at what happens in my own country, Mexico, when people protest. This is who we are. Even when we're at each other's throats, we treat each other, eventually, like family. And by the way, look, I remember when we built the synagogue, we couldn't agree on the color of the carpet. You want Israelis to agree on their political system? By the way, for those of us who are losing patience, I just have to tell you this. I have a feeling, and I hope I'm proven right, that this will be the beginning of a constitutional process for the state of Israel. And I hope that I am right. And if it's not, like Lisa's uncle David used to say, prime ministers will come and go, but number 3 Balfour Street will still be there, representing not one side or the other side, but representing the leadership of the Jewish people. You know, today I chose to speak about this because Yom Kippur represents a moment we can actually reset our relationships, our ideas, and our life. Actually, I'm going to tell you, this is like therapy for me. Because when I came back, I was devastated. You know, usually when you leave Israel, you don't want to leave. This time, I couldn't get on the plane fast enough. And it took months for me to understand what entirely is going on and what our role as American Jews needs to be. By the way, this is not the time to disengage. This is the time to remain engaged. This is the time to speak out and say what we feel. But it's also the time to remember that no matter how much we fight and how many protesters there are, our enemies are for real. They will not go away. And I'll remind you about my favorite phrase from Elie Wiesel. When asked what he learned throughout his life after surviving the Shoah, he literally said, I learned to believe in the threats of my enemies more than in the promise of my friends. Please, wherever you stand, however you see it, do not disengage. It is not the time to stop going. It is the time to go more. It is not the time to say we don't care. It is the time to care more. Because the closer we are, the more of an influence we have. That conversation between Golda and Henry Kissinger illustrates the dichotomy and the dilemma between diaspora Jews and the state of Israel. It will always exist. They are there, we're here. We cannot fight their wars. They cannot fight ours. But we do tell each other what we think. Because when you have an uncle that lives in Nebraska, and I have nothing against Nebraska, I just picked it like the first state that came to my mind. When you have an uncle that lives in Nebraska, you call him to see how he is. When you have an aunt in Maine, you call her to see how she's doing. We are a family. And how do we traditionally resolve our disputes? There's a beautiful story in the Talmud. Rabbi Meir is walking home, and he sees these hooligans outside his house. And these hooligans were there day in and day out. They didn't leave him and Bruria. Bruria was Rabbi Meir's wife. They didn't leave him alone. They were always on them. So Rabbi Meir used to pray, oh God, take the sinners away. Get rid of the sinners, right? And Bruria overheard him one day trying to curse the sinners, the hooligans. And she says to him, Mayor, were you trying to say Itamu Hataim min haaretz from the book of Psalms? May Hataim, may our sins be erased from the world? Please understand those words the way they're meant to be read, she said. You have to ask God to erase the sins from the world, not the sinners from the world. And then when Rabbi Meir prayed the right prayer, these hooligans became mentioned. When he said, God, take away their sins, they became normal human beings. And that's why no one in Israel has died in those protests. Because as bad as it is, as hard as it gets, we don't wish death upon one another. We may say the prayer, these crazy people on the other side, God, enlighten them. Show them the light. Take away their sins. But we don't pray that they themselves are taken away. The conversation has to continue and will continue. And we will continue to talk about the miracle, which is a real miracle. You know, I read a story just a couple of days ago in the Times of Israel about a soldier in the Yom Kippur War who finally got to the front because they had to hitch the rights to the front, some of them. He reunited with his Golani unit, and they brought a Soviet-era armored personnel carrier to take his unit into battle. And when they get in, all of the walls of the APC were filled with blood. And there was a jacket, it was freezing. There was a jacket on the floor of the APC, and he put it on, filled with blood. And he remembers thinking, surely it has already so much blood in it that God won't require more blood from me. And this young man went into battle like this and saw countless of his comrades die in battle. Eventually, the war was gone and was won, no in small measure, without the help of the United States. That was an incredible thing that happened. And I want to say that relationship that we have with the state of Israel as Jews in the United States was very much what caused the leadership in this country to change their minds and stand up ultimately to the Soviet Union, because that's what they were doing. Dear friends, this is not the last crisis we face. This is not the first crisis we face. It will be okay. Today is a new beginning. Today, we start anew. We get a new soul. We get a new life. As a people, let us all understand it that way. And when we fight, let's remember, let's ask for God to erase the sin, not the sinner. Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova.